Hello, and welcome to The Real USA. Today we're at Washington, D.C.'s Martin Luther King Memorial. A civil rights activist, Dr. King was suspected of being a communist and monitored by the FBI during his life, but he always remained committed to nonviolent resistance. On today's show, we'll talk about the death penalty and the excessive use of military weapons in the United States. I'm Alexandra Hall. As you watch these stories, I invite you to follow along on our Twitter at Telesur English. The death penalty, a controversial punishment that's legal in 32 states. But what most people don't know is that the process is loosely regulated and that lethal injection drugs are often untested. Nick Harper brings us this next story from Texas, the state with the highest number of executions in the United States.
In this cell, strapped to a metal bed, inmates are put to death. But America is now struggling to keep its capital punishment alive. An ethical boycott by drug makers in Europe refusing to export execution drugs to the United States has led to a shortage of lethal injections. So states are being forced to improvise, instead turning to so-called compounding pharmacies, who can supply new chemical concoctions. However, these untested mixtures have led to a series of botched executions. In July, inmate Joseph Wood took almost 2 hours to die by lethal injection in Arizona. 2 others have gone wrong this year, including Clayton Lockett, who died of a heart attack 40 minutes after his lethal injection. Texas lawyer David Matthews is concerned at how little regulation there is for pharmaceutical companies, who are now being asked to make killer drugs.
Although it's said to be a regulated area, that is pharmaceutical drugs, I think you'll find it's one of the least regulated areas in the world.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has strict regulations they expect companies to adhere to, but not when it comes to drug manufacturers.
I think the biggest, misconception is that the FDA is testing and doing clinical trials on drugs, and that's simply not true. The FDA relies almost 100% on the manufacturer, or sometimes called the sponsor of the drug.
Support for the death penalty has dropped dramatically in the last 20 years. It's now banned in 18 of the 50 states. Since 1996, opposition has risen from 18% to 37%, and more people now favour life in prison over execution. And with no obligation for companies to test how safe a drug is, campaigners argue prisoners are being put at risk of inhumane and unconstitutional suffering.
They're experimenting with new drugs. Every state's varying the dosage, the mix. The first 4 executions this year were by 4 different sets of drugs. Each one's a cliffhanger.
Texas, which executes more inmates than any other US state, uses a single drug rather than a 3-drug cocktail. So far, the execution chamber, housed here in the town of Huntsville, has not experienced problems like those seen in other states. Since 1982, the Huntsville unit has been using lethal injections. Since then, more than 500 inmates have been executed, at an average rate of 1 every 3 weeks. The state says that its drugs do work, but some say there are many unanswered ethical questions about the drugs themselves. Some Texas pharmacists are appalled at companies whose only priority is making money.
Some people are in it for financial gain without even thinking about morality.
The idea that companies who are meant to be creating medicines that cure are instead profiting from death is a bitter pill for Pliant.
Even if you make money off of something, how can you live with yourself knowing that what you made is going into killing somebody? Whether that person did anything bad or not doesn't matter. It's the fact that I made something that contributed to killing a person intentionally. And that's where I have a major problem with compounding pharmacies making execution drugs.
Campaigners feel there's simply too much secrecy. Texas, like other death penalty states, refuses to disclose the source of its drugs, meaning they can remain unregulated and untested. But if the run of botched executions continue, there'll be greater pressure to end what some see as an outdated, inhumane way of dealing with inmates. Nick Harper for Telesur, Huntsville, Texas.
In the past 4 months, experimental drugs used in lethal injections has resulted in 3 botched executions. Just days ago, a man was found innocent after serving 30 years in prison. Many activists say that these are signs of a failed justice system. Reporter Francesca Emanuele has the story.
To the question, are you in favor of death penalty?
I was. I'm beginning to be not. I'll kill them all.
I am not in favor of the death penalty at all.
2 decades ago, 80% of the Americans were in favor of death penalty. Now, only 55% support the capital punishment. The execution ways also vary. Lethal injections is the standard for 32 states where death penalty is a legal practice.
Torture. We'd gone to this medicinal hospital method of killing people, so we don't feel so guilty about it, but it's still killing.
That method had 3 failed executions in the last 4 months. Convulsion of 30 minutes and more, one of the inmates agonized for more than 2 hours. From the year 2012 on, when it was on public knowledge that the formula came from Europe, European makers prohibit the United States from using them. Currently, the government is running experiments with the inmates.
In these states that are carrying out executions are experiencing a great deal of difficulty in obtaining the drugs needed to carry out an execution effectively and safely. So they've turned to compounding pharmacies, they've turned to sort of non-traditional sources in order to obtain drugs that are not approved by the Federal Drug Administration.
At the moment, no state has revealed the origin of their lethal drugs, even though it is against the Constitution. But this is not the only failure in the system. In every 9 executions, there is an innocent. Henry, free last week after 30 years in jail, it is an example himself.
There was some DNA evidence. Unfortunately, North Carolina has a commission that is willing to test and explore other suspects. A lot of states don't have that. So there's a lot of fortuitousness about this. They got freed, but they could have been executed 10 years ago.
Capital punishment is an irreversible institutional act. In fact, reveal that in the United States many mistakes are being made.
Nearly a decade, the film director Alex Hannaford has been covering the debate surrounding the death penalty in the United States, and he's interviewed hundreds of inmates. His latest film, The Last 40 Miles, shows us the human side of death row. From Huntsville, Texas, Nick Harper has the story.
I don't rightly know how I got where I am now.
The Last 40 Miles tells the story of a death row inmate's final journey to his execution. It's the creation of journalist Alex Hannaford. He's been interviewing inmates for 11 years, and this particular prisoner, Ray, stuck in his mind.
He had been taken to the death chamber 3 times, given his last meal 3 times, and read his last rites 3 times, and then each time they'd given him a stay of execution until they decided he was intellectually disabled and they couldn't execute him anyway because of the Supreme Court decision. So he was then taken off death row and put in a regular prison cell, and he's there to this day.
During Ray's final journey, we learn about his troubled childhood and the events that brought him to this place, and the fact that he's intellectually disabled. Hannaford chose to tell the story using animation, as he felt it would provoke a stronger reaction from viewers.
I would like people to look at it and say, okay, this is based on a true story. That's interesting, because I actually felt a little bit of compassion for this guy. And I've heard people say they see it and they say, oh, I don't think he did it. And, you know, that's interesting to me, because I didn't really want to editorialize about whether he did it or not, because actually I don't really know. And you don't know in the film whether he was executed or not, but maybe it just kind of leaves you with a bit of a bad taste in your mouth at the end, thinking, oh, okay, we execute human beings rather than monsters. And I think that's the thing.
The filmmaker very much wanted to show the humanity of the inmate, to show the things that he sees and the things that he thinks on his final journey from Livingston in the east along this road to Huntsville. And in doing so, to give an insight into every death row inmate's final journey.
I've done this journey before, sir.
On the morning of an execution, they'll drive the inmate from Livingston to Huntsville. And actually, it's one of the most beautiful drives in Texas, ironically. It's pine trees and fields and little windy roads, and there's this beautiful lake, Lake Livingston, and you just think, and I started to think, that's kind of crazy, this is the last thing these guys ever see.
Texas has now banned the execution of anyone found to be intellectually disabled. But race is still an important factor, with a disproportionate number of African Americans on death row.
If you killed a white person, you were more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black person. It's as simple as that. So to say that race doesn't play a part in the justice system where the death penalty is concerned it's just false. If you're going to have an impartial, fair justice system, then fine, but we don't. We don't when it comes to the death penalty. That's all.
Hannaford feels the tide is turning against the death penalty. Increasingly, more people in America seem to feel, like Alex, that executing criminals doesn't bring closure. It only perpetuates the cycle of violence. Nick Harper for Telesur, Huntsville, Texas.
Despite President Obama's repeated commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons, his administration has approved the construction of a new nuclear arsenal. The cost, $3 trillion. Let's watch this next report.
7 out of 10 Americans wish a world without nuclear weapons, and his president expressed so in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. However, today his government is investing $3 trillion to enhance and create new nuclear weapons in the next 3 decades.
The administration is proposing to build what are basically new nuclear weapons. They argue that they're just trying to maintain the stockpile by doing some modernizing, but in reality, they are combining components from various warheads in a way that's never been done before, and so they are in effect basically making new nuclear weapons. And President Obama has promised that the U.S. wouldn't do that. He promised we would not make new nuclear weapons.
In 2010, USA and Russia agreed on the reduction of the arsenal in 30%. The next reduction was announced in 2013. However, it was never implemented, not even unilaterally.
It's Russia really that's the country that we follow, even though some people talk about other countries. The United States and Russia have over 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. So if you're concerned about somebody hitting you with a nuclear weapon, you're not concerned about China or India or Pakistan. I mean, the number of weapons that they have are really small.
What is true is that these weapons are capable of clearing thousands of lives from the face of the earth in less than 2 minutes after being detonated.
And remember, these weapons are 10 to 100 times more powerful than the weapons that were put on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. These are very strong weapons, and it really doesn't matter if they're 1, 2, or 3, or 4% off their kilotons, and that's kind of the stuff that they're working on.
The excessive use of special weapons and SWAT teams leaves communities feeling violated and unsafe. Reporter Alice Olstein spoke to the mayor of a small town outside of Washington, D.C., who was the victim of a SWAT team raid. Now he and others are fighting for new laws that would oversee police use of military equipment.
It was a calm evening here in idyllic Berwyn Heights, Maryland, until armed police raided the home of an unsuspecting family.
I heard my mother-in-law scream. It was a really frightened scream that didn't make any sense. She said, "Shy, I think it's SWAT."
The reason? A box of marijuana delivered to his house. Though no evidence connected him to the drugs, police didn't leave for more than 4 hours after shooting his 2 dogs with a machine gun.
We didn't have a warrant. We didn't have a front door. We thought that there was some drug dealer out there who thought we had the drugs. And we had a house that was torn upside down with a search and 2 enormous pools of blood.
Shy eventually recovered and even adopted new dogs, but he's since learned that similar traumatic incidents happen to hundreds of families every year in his county alone.
Violent raids on homes like this one in suburban Maryland are increasing across the country. Critics say they're turning American neighborhoods into war zones as equipment from overseas conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan gets repurposed for local police departments.
Over the past few years, local police departments like this one in Boston have been given millions of dollars of military equipment free of charge. Congress created the program to reuse hardware like these vehicles left over from U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But an investigation by the American Civil Liberties Union found that more than a third has been newly purchased for police. Researchers say that with the military gear has come a military mentality.
Police officers are being trained to believe that they are soldiers going into battle when they go into communities. And we find this troubling because their mandate is to protect and serve. And public confidence in law enforcement is really eroded when police act like soldiers going into battle.
The nationwide investigation found that the use of militarized police teams has dramatically increased over the past few decades.
Police, police, police!
Tens of thousands of homes are now raided by SWAT teams every year, a trend critics say has strayed from the program's original purpose.
The SWAT team, Special Weapons and Tactics, was created in the 1960s to deal with real emergency situations like active shooter scenarios, barricade situations, hostage-taking situations. But we're seeing over the last several decades, increasingly, SWAT teams being used for all sorts of purposes. Most alarmingly, we think, to serve search warrants in drug cases, often for very small amounts of drugs.
The police force that raided Shai's house say their frequent use of SWAT teams has led to safe execution of high-risk operations. But the mayor maintains change is needed, locally and nationally.
My family and I found justice more quickly than most, and we are very fortunate. We are fine. I am concerned that if we don't fix the systemic problems, the people who are affected by this will continue to be affected by this. It's unlikely that a SWAT team's ever going to visit my door again. One here, one here, one here, one here.
Though it's painful to do so, Shai plans to keep telling his story to rally support for restraining military-style police tactics, so people in Maryland and nationwide can feel safe in their own homes. Alice Olstein for Telesur in Washington.
In the United States, police use of military equipment is becoming increasingly common. It's something that we're even seeing in demonstrations like the ones in Ferguson, Missouri. Reynaldo Talarid has this report.